The chopsticks were already laid out wrong. Zola noticed it the moment she walked into the dining room. 12 settings arranged around a table built for celebration. Every pair of chopsticks positioned with the kind of deliberate care that meant someone had thought about this room long before tonight. Good china. The formal tablecloth, the ivory one reserved for ancestral holidays. 4 generations of the Wu family seated and waiting, hands folded, faces arranged into expressions of patient expectation. Madame Wu Chung-suk sat at the head of the table in dark silk, her posture the particular posture of a woman who had already decided how the evening would end. Zola SSI. She said the name the way she always said it, not unkindly exactly, but with the faint emphasis of someone handling an object that didn't quite belong in the room. Please, sit. Zola sat. Wu Xiangyi pulled out her chair for her, the small automatic courtesy of a man who loved his wife and had not yet understood that love without courage was just affection dressed up as something more. He squeezed her shoulder once, briefly, before taking his own seat beside his mother, and Zola felt that squeeze the way she'd felt every version of it over 3 years, warm, sincere, and entirely insufficient. The eldest uncle spoke first, in Korean, without turning to include her. Then the second aunt, gesturing toward the food while addressing Madame Wu. Then Xiangyi's younger brother, saying something that made 2 cousins laugh, low and quickly covered, eyes sliding briefly toward Zola and then deliberately away. She kept her face open, interested, the politely attentive expression she'd spent 3 years perfecting, the face of a woman following maybe 40% of a conversation she was supposed to be included in and wasn't. She understood every single word. She had it for 14 months. If you have ever sat in a room where people spoke around you like you weren't there, because they decided you couldn't understand them, comment the moment you realized you understood more than they thought. Subscribe if you believe a woman who was handed a stage for her own humiliation deserves the chance to use it for something else entirely. Because what happened at this dinner table was going to end very differently from how Madame Wu Chung-suk had spent 6 months planning it. Zola Dilamini had come to Seoul the way most decisions that change a life arrive, through a door she hadn't been looking for, in a city she'd only half believed she'd ever actually stand in. She'd grown up in Soweto, the second of 4 daughters, in a house where her mother taught primary school and her father drove long-haul freight across 3 provinces, where the particular kind of intelligence that didn't come with money learned early to be twice as prepared, twice as patient, and considerably more observant than anyone who had the luxury of not needing to be. She'd studied international trade in Johannesburg, graduated top of her cohort, and taken a position with a South African logistics firm whose sole partnership had opened a regional office needing someone who could read a contract in English, run numbers in 2 currencies, and walk into a Korean boardroom without being intimidated by the furniture. She was 26 when she arrived. 27 when she met Wu Xiangyi at a trade conference where they'd been seated at the same panel, on opposite sides of a competing bid, and he'd leaned across the table during a break and asked, in careful English, whether she thought the moderator understood what either of them was actually arguing. She'd told him no, and explained why, in 3 sentences that made him look at her the way people look at things that have just reorganized their understanding of what a thing can be. He proposed at 29. She said yes because she loved him and because some part of her still believed, with the stubborn optimism her mother had installed early, that love was eventually sufficient preparation for most rooms. She'd been wrong about that, not about him, about the room. Madame Wu Chung-suk had made her position clear within the first month, in the wordless, gracious, devastating way of women who understood that open hostility left evidence. No raised voices. No confrontations, just a consistent, patient campaign of diminishment, the dinner invitations that arrived too late to prepare for, the family conversations conducted entirely in Korean at speeds Zola wasn't yet equipped for, the compliments structured as qualifications. Your Korean is coming along. Said the way you'd say it to a child who'd managed a difficult word. You're settling in well. Said the way you'd describe a houseplant adjusting to a new window. Xiangyi translated when she asked. He smoothed things over when she noticed. He was, in the specific way of men who loved their mothers and their wives in equal but compartmentalized measures, genuinely incapable of seeing the architecture his mother had built around him. Zola had spent the first year grieving that particular blindness. The second year, she decided to stop waiting for him to see it and start building something his mother hadn't accounted for. It started with the housekeeper. Park Jeong-hee had worked for the Woo family for 11 years, a small, quick woman in her 50s who moved through the house with the invisible competence of someone who'd learned to be present without being noticed. A skill Zola recognized immediately, because she'd been practicing the same one since she arrived. They'd built a friendship in the language of kitchens, of small shared tasks, of the particular solidarity between two women who understood exactly what it meant to be underestimated inside the same four walls. Jeong-hee had started teaching her Korean the way she did everything, practically, without ceremony, without making it significant. A word here while they folded laundry. A phrase there while preparing the particular tea Madame Wu required every evening. Pronunciation was corrected, without embarrassment, the way a woman teaches another woman something she actually needs to know. By month 4, Zola could follow a full conversation if it wasn't too fast. By month 8, she could follow it at speed. By month 11, she could follow the phone call Madame Wu made to her eldest sister one Tuesday evening, standing in the hallway outside the kitchen, voice low and certain, describing a family dinner she was planning for the new year, a formal affair, all 4 generations, specifically designed to demonstrate, once and for all, that Seong-yi's foreign wife could not function in the family she'd married into. Let her try to sit through a full evening in Korean, Madame Wu had said. Let her sit there understanding nothing while everyone else talks, and let Seong-yi finally see it clearly. A wife who cannot speak to her own family is not a wife. She is a guest who overstayed. Zola had stood in the kitchen doorway for a full minute after Madame Wu moved away, her hand pressed flat against the door frame. Then she'd gone back inside and asked Jeong-hee to teach her the grandmother's dialect specifically. The grandmother, Halmoni Wu Bok-soon, 81 years old, the family's true north, a woman who'd raised 4 children alone after her husband died young, and who'd built the family's early fortune through a textile business she'd run with her own hands, spoke a regional variant that even some of the younger family members stumbled over occasionally. Zola spent 3 months on it specifically, not to show off, to show respect to the one person in the family whose respect, she had decided, was actually worth earning. And now she sat at the ivory tablecloth with the wrong chopsticks and the right preparation, and listened to Madame Wu steer the conversation toward the moment she'd been building toward all evening. Zola SSI, Madame Wu said, settling her chopsticks down with the precise finality of a woman about to make a point she'd rehearsed. We would love to hear from you this evening. In Korean, of course. As a family, we find it important that everyone at this table can participate fully. She smiled, warm as a closed door. Perhaps you could start by telling Halmoni about yourself. In your own words, we'll be patient. Every face at the table turned toward Zola. Seong-yi's hand moved slightly under the table, toward hers, the familiar preemptive comfort of a man bracing for his wife's embarrassment and his own complicated feelings about it. Zola set her chopsticks down. She turned to the grandmother, not to Madame Wu, not to Seong-yi, not to the table of waiting faces, and she began to speak. Part 2 coming, the moment the room realizes what's actually happening, one face at a time. The grandmother's eyes changed first. Not the whole face, just the eyes, a small precise shift, the kind that happens when the brain receives information it wasn't prepared for and needs a half-second to confirm it received correctly. Zola was speaking in Halmoni's dialect, not approximating it, not producing a polite, tourist Korean version of it, speaking it the way it was spoken in the grandmother's home province, with the particular vowel rounding and the dropped formal endings that marked a speaker who'd learned it from someone who'd grown up inside it, not from a textbook that had cleaned it up for general consumption. She was telling the grandmother about her own grandmother. About a woman in Soweto who'd also raised children alone, who'd also built something from nothing with her hands, who'd also been told by the world around her that what she was building wasn't the kind of thing someone like her was supposed to be building. She spoke slowly enough to be respectful, clearly enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. And she kept her eyes on Halmoni's face the entire time, the way you look at someone when you are genuinely speaking to them and not performing for the room around you. The grandmother said nothing for a long moment after Zola finished. Then she reached across the table and covered Zola's hand with her own, a gesture so unexpected that the cousin nearest the door actually flinched at it, as though something had moved in the room that physics hadn't approved. "Your accent," Halmoni said quietly in the same dialect, "is from the South. Who taught you?" "A woman who loves this family," Zola said, "and who understood, I think, that learning to speak to people properly is the most honest thing you can do for them." She didn't say Jianghe's name. She didn't need to. Jianghe was standing near the kitchen door, and the grandmother's eyes moved briefly toward her, and something passed between those two women. The housekeeper who'd worked for this family for 11 years and the matriarch who'd built it, that Zola understood was older and warmer than anything the dinner table had been designed to produce. Madame Wu had not moved. She was still holding her chopsticks, both hands around them, with the stillness of a woman whose plan had just walked off the stage it was written for and refused to come back. Zola could feel the recalculation happening across the table without looking directly at it. The rapid, invisible arithmetic of a woman trying to locate the new edges of a situation that had stopped being the one she'd arranged. Xiangyi's hand, still beneath the table near hers, had gone completely still. The eldest uncle cleared his throat, reached for his wine, said nothing. The second aunt looked at Madame Wu with the particular expression of a woman waiting to be told how to feel, found no guidance in the older woman's face, and looked back down at her plate. Zola let the silence hold exactly as long as it needed to, which was several seconds longer than anyone at the table was comfortable with, and then she turned, not to Madame Wu, not yet, to the cousin who'd laughed earlier, the quick, covered laugh, the eyes sliding away. "The dish your aunt made," Zola said, in Korean, pleasantly, nodding toward the braised short ribs at the center of the table. "Is it the same recipe she used at Xiangyi's cousin's wedding 2 years ago? I heard it was remarkable that night. I wasn't there yet, but Xiangyi described it. He said nobody in the family makes it the same way." The cousin stared at her, opened his mouth, closed it. "Yes," the aunt said from 2 seats down, in a voice that had completely reorganized itself from its earlier register. "Yes, it's the same. I can write it down for you, if you'd like." "I would like that very much," Zola said. "Thank you." She reached for her chopsticks and began to eat, the same steady, unhurried pace she brought to everything, while the table around her quietly and visibly tried to reassemble itself into a version of the evening that could still function with the evening's original architecture completely gone. Madame Wu spoke 40 minutes later, not to the table, to Zola directly, in the low, careful voice of a woman choosing words for the first time instead of deploying them. "How long?" she said. That was all. Just those 2 words in Korean, and Zola understood them to be the only honest question the woman had asked all evening. 14 months, Zola said, since the phone call. Madame Wu's expression moved through something she clearly hadn't planned to feel in front of an audience. Not guilt exactly, not embarrassment, but something adjacent to both. The look of a woman holding a mirror she hadn't chosen to pick up and finding the reflection unexpectedly accurate. "Which call?" she said, and her voice was quieter now. "The one to your sister," Zola said. "The Tuesday evening one about the dinner. I was in the kitchen doorway. You didn't see me." She paused, not cruelly. Not triumphantly. She decided weeks ago that this moment wasn't going to be triumphant, because triumph was for people who'd won something they'd been competing for, and Zola hadn't been competing. She'd been preparing. "I didn't tell Xiangyi I'd heard it. I thought about whether to confront you about it. Then I decided the best response to being told I wasn't capable of belonging to this family was to spend 14 months proving otherwise. To myself first. And then, tonight, to you." The grandmother made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. Short, genuine, the kind that arrives without permission. Everyone at the table looked at Halmoni, because nobody looked away from the grandmother when she laughed. It was simply a rule of the Wu family that had never been written down. "She reminds me of myself," Halmoni said, to no one in particular and everyone present, in her regional dialect that half the younger generation couldn't fully follow. "At 22, when Xiangyi's grandfather's family told me I was too low-born to sit at their table." She patted Zola's hand again, once firmly. "I learned their table manners in 6 months, then I bought the table." The eldest uncle laughed first, genuinely, the startled laugh of a man who hadn't expected to find the evening funny. Then the cousin. Then the aunt who'd offered the recipe, relief loosening something in her face. Madame Wu did not laugh. But she set her chopsticks down, and she looked at Zola across the table for a long, unguarded moment. The first time in 3 years she'd looked at her daughter-in-law without the careful mediation of an agenda between them. "The rice is cold," she said finally, in a voice that had lost its dinner-party precision entirely. She looked toward the kitchen. "Jianghe, can we have fresh rice, please?" It wasn't an apology. Madame Wu Chungsuk was not, by constitution, an apologizing woman. But it was the first time in 3 years she'd redirected the evening's energy toward Zola's comfort instead of away from it, and everyone at the table understood what it was, and what it had cost, and nobody mentioned it out loud. Xiangyi reached for Zola's hand under the table. This time she let him take it, not because it was sufficient, because she understood, watching his face in her peripheral vision, the dawning, complicated, slightly devastated expression of a man finally seeing the full picture of what his silence had cost his wife. That sufficient was something he was going to spend a long time building toward, and that tonight was the beginning of it, not the end. She squeezed his hand once. Then she asked the grandmother to tell her about the textile business. And Halmoni talked for 40 minutes without stopping, the whole table leaning in, even Madame Wu. Eventually, the rigid architecture of her shoulders softening by degrees across the long, warm, unplanned remainder of an evening that had been designed as an ending, and had turned, without anyone deciding it would, into something that looked considerably more like a beginning. Part 3 coming, the morning after, what Xiangyi finally says, and what Zola decides the marriage actually needs from here. Xiangyi didn't speak on the drive home. Not the first 10 minutes, when the city moved past the car windows in its usual late-evening arrangement of lit signs and empty pavements. Not the second 10, when Zola watched his hands on the steering wheel and understood from the particular tension in them that he was building toward something he hadn't found the shape of yet. She didn't help him find it. She'd learned over 3 years that Wu Xiangyi was a man who needed to arrive at honest things on his own schedule, and that rushing him there produced apologies instead of understanding, and apologies, she'd decided a long time ago, were the least useful currency a marriage could trade in. He parked in the building's underground garage and turned off the engine and sat. "You've understood everything," he said finally. "For 14 months, every dinner, every phone call, every conversation my family had in front of you assuming you couldn't follow it." "Yes," Zola said. "And you never told me." "No." He turned to look at her, and his face in the garage's pale overhead light had the specific expression of a man encountering the full cost of his own choices for the first time. Not the theoretical cost he'd occasionally glimpsed and looked away from, but the actual number, laid out plainly, impossible to negotiate down. "I should have defended you," he said. "Before any of this. Before the dinner, before the phone call, before 14 months of you sitting in rooms where my family talked around you. I should have stopped at the first time it happened, and I didn't, and I need you to know that I understand that. Not as an apology. As a fact I'm acknowledging because you deserve to hear me say it clearly." Zola looked at him for a long moment. "Say the rest," she said. "There's a rest, I can hear it." He exhaled. "I told myself my mother would come around. I told myself it wasn't as bad as it looked from the outside. I told myself the translation gap was temporary, and that once your Korean improved naturally everything would level out on its own." He stopped. I was using the future as an excuse not to do anything in the present. And while I was doing that, you were sitting in my mother's kitchen at 2 in the morning learning her mother's dialect, because nobody else in that house was willing to build a bridge from their side. Jianghe helped, Zola said. Don't forget Jianghe. Jianghe did more for your place in this family, he said quietly, than I did. That's not something I'm going to be able to sit with easily. Good, Zola said, not harshly, just plainly. You shouldn't sit with it easily. Easily means you haven't understood the size of it. He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting something rather than deflecting it. They sat in the garage for another few minutes, not uncomfortably, the kind of silence that follows an honest conversation and doesn't need filling. What do you need from me? He asked. Not what I think you need. What do you actually need from here? It was, she noted, the first time in 3 years he'd asked the question without the answer already half-formed in his expression, waiting to be confirmed. I need you to be present when it matters, she said. Not afterward, not in the car on the way home, in the room when the moment is actually happening. I can fight my own battles. Tonight proved I don't need you to fight them for me. But I need to know you're standing beside me when they happen. Not translating me to your family afterward, not smoothing things over in private. Beside me, out loud. I can do that, he said. I know you can, Zola said. I need you to actually do it. Yes, he said, simply, without qualification. She believed him, not completely. Not yet belief the complete kind was something built over time and repeated action, and she knew that, and he knew she knew it. But she believed the intention, which was a starting place she hadn't fully had before tonight. They went upstairs. Madame Wu called the next morning at 8, which was early for her. She was not, by habit, a morning caller, preferring the afternoon hours when she felt most in command of her thoughts. The early call told Zola, before a single word was spoken, that the older woman hadn't slept particularly well either. I'd like to have tea, Madame Wu said. This week, just the two of us. Zola held the phone and looked out the window at a Seoul morning going about its business, without consulting either of them. Wednesday, she said. I'm free at 2. A pause. 2 is fine. Madame Wu. Zola kept her voice even, not cold, not warm, just level. I want to be clear before Wednesday. I'm not coming to tea to reassure you that last night is forgotten. It isn't forgotten. I'm coming because I believe this family is worth the difficulty of being honest with each other, and because I think you're capable of more honesty than you've been offering me for 3 years. If that's what tea is for, I'll be there. Another pause, longer this time. That's what it's for, Madame Wu said quietly. Then I'll see you Wednesday. She hung up and stood at the window for a moment, feeling the particular quiet of a morning after a long fight had finally, fully landed, not peaceful exactly, but settled the way air settles after weather. She called her mother next. Her mother answered on the second ring, the way she always answered, like she'd been sitting near the phone specifically, though Zola knew she hadn't been. Mama, Zola said, I need to tell you about last night. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was her mother's particular gift, the capacity to receive a whole story before responding to any part of it. When Zola finished, there was a brief silence. The grandmother, her mother said, tell me about her again. So Zola told her again. Halmoni Wu Boksoon, 81 years old, who'd bought the table they'd told her she was too low-born to sit at, who'd laughed without permission and talked for 40 minutes about a textile business she'd built with her own hands, who'd held Zola's hand across a table set for someone else's victory. That woman, her mother said, is the one you keep. Whatever else happens in that family, whatever it costs, that relationship is the one worth every lesson you learned for 14 months. I know, Mama. And Seongyi. Zola looked across the apartment toward the bedroom door, where she could hear him moving around, making coffee probably, the ordinary sounds of a morning after an extraordinary night. He's learning, she said, late but genuinely. Late is not the same as never, her mother said. No, Zola agreed, it isn't. Wednesday's tea with Madame Wu, lasted 2.5 hours. Zola had expected difficulty. She'd braced for the particular difficulty of a proud woman trying to apologize without using any of the words that constituted an actual apology, the careful circling language of someone unaccustomed to contrition. What she hadn't expected was the photograph. Madame Wu produced it 40 minutes into the conversation, sliding it across the low tea table without preamble. A faded color photograph of a young Korean woman, mid-20s, standing in the doorway of a house that clearly wasn't hers, wearing clothes that were clearly her best and clearly not quite right for the occasion. An expression on her face that Zola recognized immediately because she'd seen it in her own mirror for 3 years. The expression of a woman determined to belong to a room that hadn't decided to let her in yet. "This was taken at my husband's family home," Madame Wu said. "The first time I met them, his mother thought I was too poor, too rural, not educated correctly, not the right kind of Korean for a family like theirs." She looked at the photograph without picking it back up. "She arranged a family dinner in my 4th year of marriage, specifically designed to demonstrate in front of everyone that I didn't belong." Zola said nothing. "I didn't have 14 months of preparation," Madame Wu said. "I simply sat through it, and I was humiliated, and I cried in the car afterward, and my husband didn't say anything adequate then either." She picked up her tea. "I became her, without noticing it, without deciding to. I became exactly the woman I spent 4 years being afraid of, and I did it to you, and I needed to say that to your face rather than around it." It was, Zola noted, an actual apology, fully formed, nothing circled. "Why did you finally decide to see it?" Zola asked. "Because you spoke to Halmoni in her own dialect," Madame Wu said. "And Halmoni laughed, and I realized at that moment that in 30 years of trying to earn that woman's full approval, I had never once made her laugh the way you did in 4 minutes. She set her cup down. "I was jealous before I was ashamed. The shame came when I understood why. You gave her something I was too proud to give her, genuine curiosity about who she actually was, not who she was to me." Zola sat with that for a moment, turning it over honestly. "I'm not interested in replacing you in this family," she said finally. "I never was. I wanted to be added to it. That's all I ever wanted from the beginning." "I know that now," Madame Wu said. "I knew it before tonight, if I'm being truthful. I chose not to know it, because knowing it required admitting that my objection was never really about you." "What was it about?" Madame Wu looked out the window at a view Zola knew she'd looked at every day for 30 years. "Fear," she said simply. "That my son had built something with someone I didn't choose, didn't understand, and couldn't control. And that it was better than I'd given him credit for being capable of." The honesty of it landed in the room and sat there, not comfortably, but cleanly. "Wednesday tea," Zola said after a moment. "Can it be a regular thing?" Madame Wu looked at her. Something in her face shifted, the last rigid architecture of 3 years dissolving into something that would take time to name properly, but that felt, in its early form, like the beginning of genuine respect between 2 women who'd underestimated each other in different directions. "Yes," she said, "I think it can." Halmoni called the following Saturday, not Xiangyi, not Madame Wu, but Zola directly, on her personal number that the grandmother had apparently obtained from Jianghe without asking anyone's permission. She spoke for 20 minutes in her regional dialect about a specific technique her textile business had used for dyeing fabric, which had nothing to do with anything except that she'd remembered midweek. That Zola had asked about it at the dinner table, and she hadn't finished her answer before the evening ended. Zola took notes, genuinely, because she was genuinely interested, which was, in the end, the entire reason this had worked. 6 months later, Xiangyi was present, out loud, in a moment that required it. A family discussion about a property his mother had been trying to exclude Zola from, and he said, clearly in front of everyone, that his wife was part of every decision this family made, and that anyone who needed reminding of that could come to him directly. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a speech. It was simply a man, slightly late but fully arrived, standing beside his wife in the room where it mattered. Zola caught his hand under the table the same way she had at the dinner, and squeezed once, and let him know without saying it that late was not the same as never, and that she'd decided, somewhere between a phone call overheard and a photograph produced across a tea table, that this family was worth the full, difficult, unhurried work of becoming part of. She called her mother that evening. "The grandmother called me Saturday," she said, "about dyeing techniques." Her mother laughed. "That's the one I told you." "You told me." "Did you take notes?" "Of course I took notes, Mama." "Good girl," her mother said, the same 2 words she'd been saying since Zola was 4 years old, and had done something that proved, once again, that she'd been paying attention when it counted. Some battles, Zola had learned, weren't won by fighting. They were won by listening, by preparing, by showing up to the room someone else had arranged as a defeat, and conducting yourself with such complete, grounded dignity that the room had no choice but to rearrange itself around you. She hadn't needed them to invite her in. She'd simply made herself impossible to keep out.